Welcome to FDA Product Regulation. My name is Dr. Chris Joneckis. I am the Director of the Office of Regulatory Operations and the Associate Director for Review Management at the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research in the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. This module of the course is called FDA Product Regulation, and along with my fellow presenters, we'll be talking a little bit about how FDA regulates products in clinical investigations. So the regulation of drugs and biological products. A little bit about FDA, its mission, and its organization. FDA, as you well know, is a sister agency to the National Institutes of Health under the Health and Human Services, and it has several missions. We are responsible for protecting the public health by assuring the safety and efficacy and security of all the products that we regulate, such as human and veterinary drugs, biological products, medical devices, and so on. We regulate the manufacture, marketing, and distribution of tobacco products to protect the public health and to reduce tobacco use by minors. We advance the public health by helping to speed innovations and make medicines more effective, safe, and affordable, and by helping the people get accurate science-based information they need to use these medical products and foods to maintain and improve their health. And finally, FDA plays a very significant role in the nation's counterterrorism capability. We fulfill this responsibility by ensuring the security of food supply, by fostering development of medical products to respond to deliberate and naturally occurring or emerging public health threats. This has recently been tested over the last several years by the emergence of COVID and more recently monkeypox under the declared public health emergencies. FDA has had an all-hands-on-deck approach to move these developmental therapeutics, vaccines, testing kits, and other modalities forward to both diagnose and treat the public in response to the COVID and monkeypox pandemic. FDA is organized, and as you can see here, it's composed of multiple centers that focus on specific products like drugs, biologics, veterinary medicine, and so on, and other organizational components. FDA is approximately 18,000 full-time equivalents or staff with additional contractors. Most have scientific disciplines, including medical disciplines, although there are other disciplines as well who all contribute towards fulfilling our mission and regulatory approach. We are organized in such a way that we can share resources as needed to address a variety of review and regulatory policy questions and so on. So the medical product centers shown here are the Centers for Biologics Evaluation and Research, Devices and Radiologic Health, Drug Evaluation and Research, and the Oncology Center of Excellence. And as the names imply, they typically will regulate the products as their centers are named. So typically biologics, devices and radiologic health, drugs, and so on. And then oncology products, the Oncology Center of Excellence works with all three of the centers and above to regulate various types of oncology products as well in a shared fashion. The other major centers are listed here: Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, Tobacco Products, Veterinary Medicine, Center for Toxicological Research, and the Office of Regulatory Affairs. The Office of Regulatory Affairs does most of the inspectional type of issues for all of the products that FDA regulates. These organizations and centers will actually also interact with us in certain types of regulation as well. For example, we may get involved with the Center for Food Safety as it related to a transgenic crop used to produce a biologic, or the Center for Veterinary Medicine for an animal that's used to produce a transgenic biologic as well. So we will also interact in various issues as appropriate. So a little bit about the regulatory history and framework of how we regulate all of the products, medical products. So unfortunately, tragedies have led to legislative and regulatory actions, often by garnering overwhelming public support. And these are some notable examples in the history here. Is originally 13 children died from tetanus in 1901 because they were given contaminated horse serum containing diphtheria antitoxin. Diphtheria antitoxin were basically antibodies, if you will, actually used and manufactured in a horse. And because it was contaminated and resulted in the death of many children, it led to the passage of what's known as the Biologics Control Act of 1902. This is actually probably the oldest public health law of its kind in the world. The BCA Act was passed to ensure the purity and safety of serums, vaccines, and similar products used to treat diseases in various types of humans. There was an overwhelming outcry in leading up to the 1906 passage of the Food and Drug Act that there were multiple cures and claims for worthless and dangerous medicines. So Congress passed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1906, which only prohibited interstate commerce in misbranded and adulterated foods, drinks, and drugs. It had nothing to do with assuring the safety or efficacy of any of these products. In 1938, or just before 1936, I should say, there were over 100 individuals who died due to ethylene glycol contamination in the elixir of sulfonamide, and that led to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. At this point, the law required new drugs to be shown to be safe before marketing, and this started a whole new approach to drug regulation. Again, proving that safe tolerances be set for unavoidable poisonous substances. A few others, more recent approaches. In 1955, there was something known as the Cutter incident, in which 260 children either contracted polio or died because the Salk vaccine was not properly inactivated by the manufacturer. And this led to the formation of the Division of Biological Standards created within NIH in 1955. And the Division of Biological Standards actually oversaw the regulation of biological products as such. In 1972, the regulation of biologics was transferred from NIH back to FDA. Thalidomide sleeping pills resulted in severe birth defects in thousands of babies in Western Europe in early 1962. Thalidomide was kept off of the market because of the insistence of several FDA staff and the FDA organization that there were serious side effects as a result of non-clinical or animal studies to assure the safety of the product. So this led to the passage of the Kefauver-Harris Drug Amendment Act of 1962, which passed to ensure greater drug efficacy now and drug safety. So for the first time, manufacturers were actually required to prove to the FDA that their products were effective before they could be marketed. And of course, we had the unfortunate cyanide poisoning with several of the Tylenol capsules in 1982, and that led to the Federal Anti-Tampering Act of 1983, which resulted in a whole series of additional changes to how we package and monitor and control various types of drugs on the market. So the framework in which we regulate all these products start with essentially the laws. And so the laws are, of course, as I've given you some examples of, are passed by Congress. And then we have to interpret how we're going to apply these laws. And the laws, therefore, then we promulgate various types of regulations or rules, and those become codified in the Code of Federal Regulations. And that's sort of, it interprets the higher level direction that is set by Congress and how we interpret these laws. The FDA then develops a series of documents called guidances, which basically provide our current thinking on how one can comply with these various types of regulations or rules. There are also external standards, that are standards that are typically developed by what's known as consensus organizations in various areas. There are a large number of consensus organizations and a large number of standards that can facilitate development of drugs and biologics. This has become incredibly important in the past 10 to 15 years as the number of these standards have continued to increase, and have found a niche in how we regulate these types of products. And then we have various types of SOPs, or standard operating procedures, with how we do our internal business. They may contain certain types of policies and precedents as well, to some extent, or how we actually operate. Policies and precedents are harder to be seen visibly to the external population because all of the above are all published. The policies and precedents sometimes are included in various types of guidances, and eventually they will make their way up to the guidance level. But a lot of these are evolving. We have many new and novel products in FDA, especially biologics, such as cellular therapies, gene therapy, new types of vaccines, phages, FMPs, fecal microbiotica transplantations. And so a lot of these are done, we don't have enough information or enough consistency or understanding to feel comfortable developing guidance. So a lot of these, how we address some of these things, are dealt with in a policy or precedent area, which makes it very important if you're developing these types of products to interact with us through meetings and various other kinds of interactions, so you can understand how we're going to regulate this and so on. Some of the notable laws and statutes up here are the Public Health Service Act, which is what's used to regulate a lot of biological products, and of course the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is used to regulate drugs, devices, and a whole host of other things. So there are some other regulatory laws here that have influenced how FDA works over the years, some of which I've talked about already. I'm just going to hit a few highlights here that may help to explain certain things. The 1944, the Public Health Service Act, covers a broad spectrum of health concerns, part of which is how we regulate biological products and how we control communicable diseases. we actually still use the communicable disease provisions or provisions 361 in terms of how we would regulate tissue transplantation, essentially. For example, tissue banks and so on. That is a different regulatory method than more traditional drugs or biologics. The Medical Device Amendments Act 1976 actually added devices to the overall regulation of FDA, included diagnostic products. It talks about following quality control procedures, pre-market approval for some, or meeting performance standards for others. So up until that time, the devices were not really regulated by FDA to any great extent. Again, the Orphan Drug Act, which promoted research in orphan drug products and facilitated through various types of patent issues and other issues, facilitated how one could get orphan drugs onto the market. The Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act is basically the law that allowed for generic drugs, not biologics, but drugs, and provided the whole framework for how a lot of studies would not have to be repeated on those drugs, such as the clinical studies and preclinical studies and such. It provided a more leverage to what was already done for the initial approval of these types of drug products. The National Childhood Vaccines Injury Act basically gave FDA the authority to recall a whole series of biologics and authorize civil penalties, but it also, in large part, facilitated the use of vaccines in that it provided compensation to people who were found to be injured by certain vaccines without the necessity of going through tort procedures. And the manufacturers were not held liable for civil actions due to vaccine damages or death. So that facilitated how one can take various types of vaccines and foster the whole ability to use those in a variety of patients. In 1992, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act required biologics and drug manufacturers to pay for applications and supplements for review. This has been authorized every 5 years and is followed by a whole series of user fees for things like generic drugs, medical devices, biosimilars, and so on. The Best Pharmaceuticals for Children's Act, or the BPCA Act, did a lot to facilitate safety and efficacy of both patent and off-patent medicines for children. But more importantly, or as important, I should say, it gave us biosimilars being additional biologics that could be approved in a somewhat similar way to generics for drugs. So biosimilars would be the equivalent in a sense for generic drugs for those that were already approved. The Pediatric Research Equity Act required sponsors to conduct clinical research in pediatric applications for a whole series of drugs and biological products, facilitating their use in pediatric populations as appropriate. And one last thing I'll just mention is the Food Drug Administration Safety Innovation Act had authorized a lot of different things. The one thing it did in particular was in 2012, we had an outbreak of fungal meningitis that was clearly linked to contaminated compounded drugs, and unfortunately resulted in the loss of 64 lives and caused more than 700 illnesses. So Congress enacted the Drug Quality and Security Act at that point to ensure greater regulatory oversight of facilities creating compounded drugs. So, like I mentioned in the beginning, way back in the early 1900s, unfortunately, there are still outbreaks or occasional tragedies that do occur that also will facilitate and foster the need to have various types of legislation. Most of these other legislations did not result, by hardly any, if any, resulted from any kind of tragedy or loss of life. It resulted from basically Congress and others looking at systems and seeing what's the best way to facilitate an effective drug regulation system and which the best way to facilitate the development of these drugs. And many of these laws do facilitate that through a whole series of expedited reviews and accelerated approvals and so on and so forth. The regulatory law, the last one would be the Food Drug Administration Reauthorization Act, FDARA, which again reauthorizes all of these user fees, initially starting with the PDUFA user fee for drugs and biologics, having devices, generics, and biosimilars. And these get reauthorized every 5 years. They provide additional resources. They provide performance goals, which FDA has to try to meet in order to review and regulate a whole variety of these types of medical products across. So I mentioned earlier that we have the regulations, which is how we interpret the laws. So the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21, contains most of the rules that are used by FDA, and they are organized here, as you can see. So the various subchapters related to medical products, so drugs, biologics, medical devices, radiological health issues, and so on. There are also some other regulations that are covered in some of these areas, which also will impact, including impact on clinical research, such as protection of human subjects, financial disclosure by clinical investigators, which is required, institutional review boards, which is required of every drug or biologic initial drug application when it's going to be studied in patients. Good laboratory practices for non-clinical lab studies, which are used to support those initial investigations and such. And again, some of the labeling and advertising is present as well. So there are other regulations, and they're quite extensive, as you can see in the printed form. The three major ones that will be of most use to, I think, people moving into a clinical investigation, initial studies, let's say in humans, which would be the investigation on the drug application, or the new drug application, which is when an individual, you have enough sufficient information developed in various clinical studies, non-clinical studies, manufacturing to actually submit what's known as an application for marketing. And that would be an NDA here or a BLA if it's a biologic. And then, of course, for devices, they have similar mechanisms for initial studies in various patients or marketing applications, or also the ability to meet certain performance criteria in order to be marketed. So these are the major CFR parts that direct what we do in the initial development, regulation, marketing, and actually some of the post-marketing as well of these products. So guidances, there are a ton of guidances which have developed over the years on a variety of subjects that help to guide individuals through the initial new drug application when you want to study something for the first time in man and humans, or marketing applications of post-approval. So again, it is our current thinking on matters under our jurisdiction. It's how we are interpreting policy. It's how we're interpreting these regulations and rules. It provides new or different regulatory expectations that really aren't apparent in the statute or regulations. Again, you're drilling down further and giving, in some cases, examples, in some cases, looking at a question and answer format to provide different ways in which one can provide input. They're usually written at FDA with input. So these are just about always submitted or provided as draft for public comment. And so various individuals will comment on those from academics, government agencies, domestic and foreign industry, regulators, and so on and so forth. A lot of people provide their input. We look at all those input and we figure out, could we have said something clearer? Is there something we forgot to include? Is there a different approach we should be taking? Often, sometimes these can be discussed in forums and workshops. These guidances, we have to follow what is known as good guidance practices on these. They are not legally binding, unlike regulations and laws, which are legally binding. These are our best thinking on matters, how one can apply, if you will, to fulfilling the various types of regulations and laws. They're not legally binding on the applicants, on the public. However, FDA employees can only depart from the guidance only with appropriate justification and supervisory concurrence. So in other words, even though this is our best thinking and such, it may not work in all cases because it's a new or novel kind of an approach, and the particular individuals following what's in the guidance, and it just doesn't really fit in this situation, maybe because the clinical situation is different, or the manufacturing situation has changed, and so on. And so we can deviate from these, but again, there's an internal sort of process we have to go to. Although the good guidance, or the guidance does provide our current thinking and ways in which one can comply with these various things, industry can choose any approach they want that meets those relevant statutes and regulations. And that often is the subject of a discussion with the agency. A lot of new and novel products there for where standardized approaches just don't work. We experienced that a lot in CBER with the cellular and gene therapies and vaccines and other new developing products. There's a lot of interaction, a lot of discussion over time to go back and forth to figure out, okay, how can we assure a certain level of safety and efficacy with these products? What works in this particular situation? One thing I will mention is the International Council for Harmonization, or ICH. ICH has been in existence for actually greater than 30 years, and it develops various types of guidances in the areas of quality or product quality, if you will, efficacy or clinical areas, and safety. Safety being mostly the non-clinical types of pharmacology or safety for patients, and also multidisciplinary, so things related to electronic submissions and format and content of applications and so on. Originally, it was founded and participants included Europe, the US, Japan, Canada, and Switzerland were sort of observers. Over those years, recently, its change includes many worldwide regulatory agencies, and it provides basically guidance on harmonization that hopes to ensure safe, effective, and high quality products. And especially for industries and such, they don't have to meet individual requirements. The requirements have been sort of harmonized so that hopefully one study, taking into consideration a variety of factors, can work in these various regions across the globe. Development of medical products is in many ways global, and so the regulation of such should be to the point that that's feasible. So we develop these ICH guidances, which FDA adopts. So ICH guidances are basically FDA guidances once we have adopted these. And it's a whole regulatory consensus of going through, working with regulatory and industry experts. They go out for public comment, just like all of our guidances do. It helps to facilitate, again, mutual acceptance of data so that you don't have to have different clinical studies in various jurisdictions. And one thing we have well over 10 years ago is the common technical document, which is an agreed upon format for how we look at the presentation of summaries, reports, and data to the various worldwide regulatory authorities. There are also, for example, many may be familiar with the World Health Organization, which also develops a large number of guidance documents. FDA will often work closely with the World Health Organization, but although while ICH documents are considered FDA documents because we adopt those, World Health Organization documents are not. They may be appropriate for certain situations for how one can comply with, again, our regulations, laws, and so on. But you really need to have that discussion with FDA prior to using those, because they're sort of in many ways set up for a different audience and different levels of approach and considerations, if you will, for developing products. So let's talk about this real quickly so you can understand. Again, we have drugs, biologics, and devices, and there's a little bit of an overlap, but we generally try not to do that. So we formally define a drug in our regulations, as a substance recognized by an official compendium or formulary, a substance that's intended to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease, a substance other than food intended to affect the structure or any function of the body, a substance intended to use as a component of a medicine, but it's not a device or a component part or accessory of a device. And it's important to understand that biological products are included within this definition and are generally covered by the same laws and regulations, but differences exist regarding their manufacturing processes. You can think that drugs are chemically synthesized versus biological products, which are manufactured through biological processes. It is now feasible to chemically synthesize some types of biological products, but not all. Although commercially, that really doesn't happen in the world. And I should say, this is a legal definition. This is a definition from the law, not from the regulations. Biologic is virus, therapeutic serum, toxin, antitoxin, vaccine, blood component or derivative, allergenic product, protein, or analogous product, or acetophenamine or derivative of arsophenamine or any other trivalent organic arsenic compound applicable to the prevention, treatment, or cure of a disease or condition of human beings. You can see that this definition, clearly reflects the heritage of biological products, the antitoxin. And a lot of these derivatives here were related to treating public health and communicable diseases as such. A medical device can be defined as an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or other similar related article, including component part of an accessory, which is a substance recognized by the National Formulary or U.S. Pharmacopoeia, intended for the use in the diagnosis of disease or other condition, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in man or other animals, or intended to affect the structure or function of the body of man or other animals, and does not achieve its primary intended purpose through chemical action within or on the body of man or other animals, and which is not dependent upon being metabolized for the achievement of its primary intended purpose. The term does not include software functions excluded pursuant to another regulation, legal. So this course is going to focus on drugs and biologics. There'll be a few comments on devices at the end, because just about everything we're seeing now would be defined as a combination product, which is a combination of a biologic and a drug, or a device and a biologic, or a device and a drug, or a biologic and a drug. So they can get very confusing. So we're just going to basically touch a little bit on devices at the end so you can understand them and their role. So the last part I would like to discuss is the product life cycle. So here is a hypothetical, if you will, or traditional or ideal life cycle in the development and regulation of a drug or a biologic. Often there's typically a preclinical phase and then a clinical development phase. There is a preclinical phase in which there's discovery, a certain particular type of compound or biologic has been synthesized or developed and tested in various models and determined that they would have an effect to affect a particular type of a disease. At some point in time, there most likely, but not always, maybe some type of pharmacological and toxicological testing, sometimes involving animals, often lots of laboratory work to better characterize and understand the product and be able to control its quality and purity and safety to a point. So all this work happens is what we call the pre-IND phase, or prior to filing an investigational new drug application. An IND is required and must be approved by the FDA, and that's approved in quotes, prior to studying this in patients. And so a lot of this work that you see here, including, and this will be covered in subsequent sessions, will be submitted along with information on the clinical trials and other areas and placed into investigational new drug development. We typically, in a traditional investigational new drug development program, you'll have various phases. The first phase is really assessing the safety of the product in humans. Second phase is sort of dose finding, safety as well, perhaps understanding a little bit more about the efficacy of that. And phase 3 would be typically looking at the safety, and again, but really the efficacy. Does this product, this is efficacious, and what would be the indication if this product were to be marketed? How would it be used? How would it be treated? And so on. And of course, there's manufacturing that goes on during this as well, so that one can consistently make a product that's going to deliver the intended therapeutic effect. But again, this is really in an ideal or traditional area with a lot of products now, depending upon orphan disease, for example, where there's very limited numbers of patients. We may not have these 3 distinct phases and 3 distinct trials. There could actually, in some cases, be only one trial that's set up in such a way that it's an adaptive trial, that depending upon the results that happen, they determine the next course of the study and so on. So sometimes, again, very rare patients will sort of compress this into 1 or maybe 2 trials to try to, again, determine appropriate safety and efficacy and what's the appropriate dose and so on. Assuming that a product is then submitted for marketing, which is when it can be commercialized, there will be a submission of a biologics license application, a new drug application, or for devices, a pre-market application. They'll go through a review. We have to assure that the manufacturing facilities are in compliance with what's known as current good manufacturing principles and so on. And if it's marketed, there can be then a post-marketing phase, if you will. The post-marketing phase may be making changes to the manufacturing process, and maybe adding a new indication for a new patient population, or a new dosage form to make it easier to administer and so on. So you think about it, this can be the overall, at a high level, the life cycle of a drug and biological